Okay, hi everyone. I think we'll get started. Just hang on a minute. So, okay, here we go. So I'm just going to give a brief overview today of, what you should be doing when you're judging rounds of the internal moots. It's all pretty straightforward stuff, but it's just good to keep it in mind so that, the competition's fair for the competitors and things like that. So there's 4 things I'm going to be talking through today. First of all, I'll just go through some Moot Procedure stuff. Second, I'll talk about questions from the bench, what sorts of questions you should try and ask, how many you should ask, and so on. And then I'll move on to feedback, and finally onto scoring. I think this is a live hangout as well as it's being recorded for later. If you're on the live hangout, feel free to ask any questions at any stage. And if you're watching it later, of course, feel free to ask me any questions. Or you can just contact me through Facebook Messenger. I'm very happy to answer any questions at any time. So just a few general points to start off with. First of all, thanks very much for volunteering to judge a round of the internal moots. We can't put on these competitions without people volunteering to judge, and it is really great if you sign up. That being said, if you sign up, it is really important that you commit to it and that you don't cancel at the last minute or anything like that. It's very difficult to find people to replace you at the last minute, and it's not really fair for the competitors who put a lot of preparation into the moot. And so, yeah, something just to keep in mind as well, that the earlier rounds of the internal moots are very casual. Mooters will be dressed casually, that's fine, you can dress casually. Later rounds, possibly a bit more formal, but at that stage, it's likely to be barristers or others judging, so that's fine. And then, yeah, so don't worry if it's been a while since you've studied the area of law that you're judging a moot for, but definitely try and read the problem question beforehand, and maybe just once you've read the problem question, that might remind you of a few cases or statutory provisions that are important in that area. It is kind of helpful just to review that if you get the chance, because then your judging will be fairer for the mooters. And finally, I'm going to go through this, but some basic procedures that you should know just to make sure that the moot runs smoothly. And this slide is sets out details. So competition directors, Sarah and Sarah, mooting judging coordinators, Nicholas and Jadine. So that's their emails there, and you can contact them about anything. If you do need to change a moot time or anything like that, those are the people you should be contacting. Okay, so first of all, we'll move on to moot procedure. Okay, so before the moot, everyone meets around the moot court. You find the moot conveners, they'll mark your name off, they'll tell you who you're judging, give you the mooters, and so you'll walk down with everyone to the room you're in, and it might be a good idea to, normally the room's near the library, it might be a good idea to grab a few books and set up a bit of a lectern. And then, so it's good to explain how the moot's going to work, so the order of appearances and submissions, stuff like that, especially in moots like the torts moot where there might be new mooters, and set up the room in the right way. So I think, so this slide tells you exactly how the room should be set up, whether you're in a library room or the moot court. So that's a helpful diagram there that you can even just bring with you or remember it. And if you set up the room in that way, that should be, that should be good. Okay, so moot structure. This is something that you can, this slide is something even that you can have with you when you're judging, if you want to. So you'll start off by asking for written submissions. Make sure that the 2 sides are also giving a copy of their submissions to each other. And then it's a good idea to have a read through of the submissions. Don't take too long, but just get an idea about what each side's going to be saying during the moot. And then once you've done that, you can take appearances. Senior counsel for the appellant goes first, senior counsel for the respondent then goes, and then you move on to submissions. So invite each person in turn. At the end of each person's submissions, you can take a bit of time just to write some notes or think about anything that you need to, and then you'll move on to the next person. And this slide also sets out the order for that. So senior counsel for the appellant, junior counsel for the appellant, senior counsel for the respondent, junior counsel for the respondent. Okay, so just a few more things to, I guess, keep in mind. First of all, if you're allocated to judge a friend, you should raise this with the judging coordinators or the moot conveners. It may be that it's not a problem. You talk about it with them and you figure out that it will be fine. But you just want to make sure you raise it anyway at the first stage. And it's also important, especially if you are judging someone you know, or even if you're not judging someone, just to not be overly familiar at the start of the moot. You might want to be, you can definitely be friendly, but just don't be too enthusiastic, because you don't want to seem like you're biased either way or anything like that. And then of course, at the end of the moot, you can be as friendly as you like, and that's fine. So, okay. So moving on to the second part of the presentation is questions from the bench. Yeah, so essentially questions are probably the most important part of the moot, of a moot, I would say, because it really pushes competitors to think about the implications of their arguments, and it does sort of separate, I guess, the better mooters from not some of the weaker mooters. So it's a really important part of the moot. So questioning should get harder, I guess, each round. If you're judging the torts moot or the first year moot or something like that, you don't want to go too hard with the questions, I suppose, in any round. I mean, you definitely need to ask questions, but don't be too harsh when people are doing their first moot. If you are judging quarterfinal round of any moot, then you do really want to ask a lot of questions at that stage, for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, it does really distinguish the better mooters and those that should progress, and also it's good for the mooters themselves, because those that do progress, they'll be getting judged by barristers, maybe judges, and so it's really good for them to have this very full-on kind of practice before they get to performing in front of actual practitioners. And so I guess in terms of how many questions you ask, you do want to ask a similar amount of questions of all of the mooters in the moot, but I would also say that especially in the preliminary rounds, the abilities can be quite varying. If you notice that there's a really good mooter, you might want to challenge them a little bit more, maybe ask them a few more questions, or maybe just ask harder questions. And on the same hand, if there's a weaker mooter, you don't want to just ask so many questions that it just tears apart their case unnecessarily. So maybe, either a few less questions, or perhaps what's better is just try and ask, I guess, easier questions. So this is just a slide, I guess, about question answering. Not sure I have that much to say on that, but yeah, reference to the castle is always good. Okay, so moving on to what kinds of questions you should ask. So you definitely want to try and ask a range of questions. So, some, like on this slide, what are the facts in that case? Maybe some procedural questions. Are we bound by this decision? Stuff like that. And then you always want to, if you can, you really want to try and ask questions about the arguments themselves, like how good the arguments are. Try and test the strength of the arguments. I mean, one way to do that, which is quite effective, is sort of asking hypotheticals. Like if your argument says this, then in this case, would we have to say that kind of thing? I think those sort of questions are good. It really gets people thinking about their arguments, and they're quite tricky to ask. So I won't go through all of the questions on this slide, but this slide does set out some questions that you can ask. I'd also recommend maybe if you have time before the moot, it's helpful to think of some questions that you could ask. When you're reading through the problem question, you might sort of think, oh, well, this is going to be a problem, or that might be a problem. So maybe just note it down and keep that in mind before the moot itself. And so this slide has some more, I guess, helpful questions. So yeah, you can even, keep the questions from these two slides in mind and refer to them when you're judging. Okay, so the third part of this presentation, moving on to giving feedback. Okay, so yeah, most importantly, always be nice when you're giving feedback. Of course, you can be, some people judge in different ways. You might be quite a severe judge, ask a lot of questions, frown a lot. That's fine. But in feedback, you really do want to make sure you're being very positive, trying to encourage people to keep mooting, not just give it up then and there. So don't go into the substantive law out of the submissions. That is just because, it's fairer for all of the competitors. They should be doing that themselves, I guess. You shouldn't be helping them out there. But definitely point out issues like things like citations. I think that does often seem to be a problem that comes up. The AGLC, a lot of people don't quite follow it, so definitely try and remind people about that. So a good way to do it might be to note a few main areas that they can improve on. Just pick out for each person like 2 or 3 things that they should try and improve on, 2 or 3 things that they've done well in. Letting them ask questions, that's very good. And definitely never show them the scores or say who won or anything like that. You should do the scores once they've left or you've left or something like that. You don't want, that's all very confidential. So yeah, just be careful about that. So this slide also suggests using the scoring guide, which you'll get a copy of, as a foundation for feedback. It's also very helpful. The scoring guide is actually incredibly helpful because it sets out a whole lot of different things for each part of the moot. Okay, so this brings me on to the final part of the presentation, which is the scoring. Okay, so this is on the slide. It shows the mooting score sheet that you'll have in each moot. Mooters are scored individually out of 100, and there's 5 categories that they're judged against, and the scores have to be between 50 and 100. So that's all pretty straightforward. So this is just sort of some general commentary on each of the 4 bands that you can rank mooters in. So poor, 50 to 64. I guess, a mooter in this category really struggles to answer questions, either, can't give a good answer to the question, and also maybe loses composure, gets really flustered, something like that. Perhaps their arguments are really weak, aren't really backed up by much law, or it's evident that they haven't done much research into the law or something like that. So essentially, well below the standard of the other people in the competition. Average 65 to 74. So I would say like most mooters fall into this category. A mooter in this category is able to answer questions, maybe not give the best answer, but can manage a few different answers, knows the law relatively well, and has pretty strong arguments, although perhaps not as strong as some other mooters. So 75 to 84, that is someone that really stands out. I would say that, just going on to the outstanding 85 to 100, honestly, I think in internal moot, it's unlikely that anyone's going to fall into that band. I think 85 to 100 is very, very, very high level. So my sense would be that if you have a mooter who is really good and is quite noticeably above the average, they're probably going to fall within that 75 to 84 range still, unless they're just absolutely outstanding. They've got a really original argument. They know the law inside out, stuff like that. But mainly for good mooters, if you have a good mooter in your moot, you're looking for the 75 to 84 range. And yeah, so mooters in this category, they do know the law very well, and that's evident in their presentation. They're also good at answering questions, so they can maintain their manner, they don't get flustered. They don't have to have perfect answers all the time, obviously, but most of their answers are very good, and they do try and address the judge's concern in answering the questions. Okay, so the next, this slide just sort of is a screenshot of the actual judging guidelines. So these are really helpful when you're scoring people. It's really good to look at these, and they're very, very detailed. So, and pretty much cover everything. So it's really good to have referred to this. I won't, go through it now, but just keep that in mind. Yeah, and so the next few slides will just sort of go through each of the 5 areas that you'll be looking at when you're scoring. The first one is organisation of presentation and timing. So this includes things like setting out the structure very clearly, spending enough time on each of the issues, and also flexibility to move between submissions. So you might decide to ask a question that sort of moves someone from their first submission to their second submission, or from one point they're making to something they were going to make later on. That's quite a good question to ask, because it tests if the mooter can deal with being flexible about how they're presenting and not just sticking to a pre-prepared script. Yeah, and then in terms of time management in this, it's about whether, you might ask a lot of questions during the moot. How does the mooter manage that with their time? Do they just run out of time? Or do they still manage to kind of deal with the questions and at least outline or at least deal with their second point briefly? So yeah, I suppose it's not the end of the world if the timing isn't quite equal for each submission or something like that, if they've been asked a lot of questions, but it's more about how they've managed question answering and stuff like that. Okay, so the next one is development of argument. This is out of 26, so it is, whereas the previous one was out of 14. So this is quite important, and should be quite important in determining where you think the mooter lies overall. So the first thing here is level of understanding of the law, facts, and remedies sought. So that's all very, very important stuff. Persuasiveness of the arguments. Do you think their arguments are backed up by their law? How many authorities do they use? Do they use enough authorities? On the one hand, a mooter might, I guess, be referring to too many authorities. You don't want someone to be referring to so many authorities that it's not helpful, but are they, every time a mooter makes a point of law or something like that, they should have an authority to back it up. So that's quite critical. And if they don't, you should ask them if they have one, and if they don't, that's obviously not very good. Ability to go straight to the critical issues. That's really important, especially if you're judging mooters that are doing respondent. Are they, are they just sort of dealing with something that's not really an issue? Or, have they identified exactly what is the critical issue between the appellant and the respondent, and have they gone straight to that? So that's really good. If mooters are doing that, you should definitely give them points for that. Policy arguments. A mooter's argument shouldn't only be based on policy, obviously, but it is quite good if they can weave that in among other things. That does show that they've done further research on the issues. So that's definitely a good thing. So ability to address opposing arguments and integration of rebuttal. So I guess this mainly applies in internal moots in the early rounds. It's a bit hard for applicant or appellant to do that because they get the written submissions of the other team like just before the moot starts. So maybe don't be too harsh on the applicant or appellant there, but definitely for respondents in the early rounds who have just listened to the whole applicant appellant speech, you should definitely be looking at how they're responding to the applicant or appellant. And yeah, so it's a matter of how do they integrate responses into their own submissions. And yeah, so that's also very important in terms of scoring respondent mooters. Okay, so next one is questions from the bench. This is also out of 26, again, indicating that it's a very important part of the moot. So preparation for anticipated questions. I guess this means, it might be hard to tell whether this is the case, but obviously if you're asking difficult questions and it seems like the mooters have considered these beforehand, that's a really good sign. If they've come up with them on the spot, that's amazing, but it's great if, it seems like the mooters have already considered the implications of their arguments. And yeah, clarity and persuasiveness of responses. So are the mooters answering your questions directly? Obviously, it's one of the hardest things to do in mooting, but, are they getting to the crux of your issue, or are they sort of skirting it around it or something like that? Making concessions where needed. So you don't want, mooters shouldn't be easily persuaded to concede arguments. That's a bit concerning. But, if there is a weak point in their submission that they're just getting pushed on and pushed on and pushed on, perhaps it's appropriate for them to accept that they lose on that point and move on. Although I think, you have to be a bit careful with concessions. If mooters are conceding like whole submissions or something, that's definitely, I think, a bit too drastic. But yeah, I guess that point is also just about mooters recognizing that if a point they're pushing is just not getting acceptance with the bench, it's better to try and move on rather than stubbornly stick to it and keep on trying to convince the bench that they're right. Manner and question answering is very important. So, I guess even if they're not answering questions that well, maybe it's good that they're maintaining composure. And courtesy, of course, is very important. So mooters definitely shouldn't be, if you start asking a question or anything like that, mooters shouldn't be interrupting you. If they do, you should mention that they shouldn't do that at the end. So yeah, mooters have to be very respectful to the judge. And the next thing is that, which is again very difficult to do, is to try and make sure the responses to the questions flow into their submissions. So is it, a question, perhaps a mooter answers a question and then is sort of like, oh, going back to my submissions, I was here, I was there, and it's a bit, broken up like that. It's great when a mooter can actually just sort of flow right back into their submissions. So that's something to look out for as well. Yeah, so ability to deal with irrelevant, obscure, and difficult questions. It might be that, and this can be quite a good thing to do, you might want to throw in a few slightly relevant questions or a few obscure questions that, because, the mooter should be able to identify that that's not relevant or it's not really very important for their argument and be able to deal with that quite quickly. So those questions are quite good again, and it is quite important to see how mooters respond to them because it indicates how well they know their argument and what is actually an issue. Okay, manner and expression. Yeah, so I guess, this is pretty straightforward stuff, but first of all, mooters should always be very formal, have respect for the judges, the other members of council. Yeah, any comments by mooters that sort of disparage the other side or anything like that are not good. You want to make sure everyone's being very courteous to each other. Yeah, so eye contact, also very important. If there's more than one judge, they should be sharing it equally. If there's just the one judge, that's a bit easier. But yeah, even so, it's important that they have a good level of eye contact, and also, because they shouldn't just be reading. So, I mean, manner's quite obviously very subjective, so it's quite difficult to score, I guess. The basic points is, that they should be engaging and conversational. Apart from that, you might have a whole range of different manners which are not necessarily right or wrong. Some people are a little bit more enthusiastic or energetic. Some people are a bit more measured. So I guess as a judge, it's I don't know, I guess a bit hard to score manner because it is subjective. So yeah, I guess just when you're looking at, just keep in mind that just because someone's, I guess, style might not be to your style doesn't necessarily mean they deserve a lower score. Just think about those main things of at least were they engaging, were they conversational. Yeah. So, and also again, this manner point also goes to manner when dealing with questions from the bench. Are they able to deal with that and remain calm, or do they sort of lose composure or anything like that? Okay, so next is written submissions. Yeah, so you can have a brief read through of these before the moot. You can also just look at them again after the moot before you're doing the scoring. Conciseness is very important, and it's very important that they've followed the AGLC. So I think, and that is something that you can also point out to them if their citations are a bit lacking in that respect. You can point that out. Consistency with oral submissions is important, and that's why it's good to look at their written submissions before the moot begins. If, I guess, someone's written submissions are quite different from their oral submissions, you might want to ask them a question in the moot about that. Identifying the relief, that's important, and yeah, spelling and grammar errors. I think, yeah, really spelling grammar errors aren't very good. If that's in there, that's definitely a point against them. Okay, so in terms of score moderation, yeah, so I guess don't stress too much about whether your scoring mood is very high or very low or anything. I mean, I guess try and make the scores more around the middle, but the coordinators will look at the scores, and if there's any sort of extreme outliners or anything like that, they'll contact you and figure it out. So yeah, I guess the main thing is just to follow the guidelines, and that should be fine. Yeah, so I think that's the end of the main presentation. As I said at the beginning, this is an online hangout, so if anyone else is on it and would like to ask me a question, feel free to do so now. If you're watching this at a later time and you want to ask a question, feel free to ask me, or you can ask probably